The sterile white halls of St. Mary's Children's Hospital in New York buzzed faintly with the hum of machines and the shuffle of nurses' shoes. Outside, the city was alive, cars honking, people rushing on, but inside, time seemed to move slower, quieter. Alexander Grant, CEO of Grant Industries, strode down the corridor in his tailored navy suit. Everything about him spoke of control, the watch on his wrist, the purposeful rhythm of his steps, even the way his eyes never lingered too long on anyone. He wasn't here out of compassion. The hospital was one of the many institutions funded by his company's charity wing, a project more about image than empathy. A nurse led him to room 212. "She's been waiting for you," the nurse said softly. "Waiting for me?" He frowned. "Who?" "Lily Carter, 8 years old. She asked for you by name." Alexander's brow furrowed. He didn't know any Lily Carter. Still, he stepped inside. The room was small but warm. Stuffed animals sat neatly on a shelf beside medical equipment. By the window sat a little girl with pale skin and soft blonde hair, holding a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. Her big blue eyes lit up when she saw him. "Are you Mr. Grant?" she asked, her voice weak but sincere. "Yes," he said, glancing at his phone. "How can I help you, young lady?" She hesitated, then held out a small envelope with trembling hands. "Can you read this letter? It's very important." Alexander sighed quietly but took the letter. The handwriting inside was uneven, each letter carefully drawn by a small hand. "Dear Mr. Grant, people say you help a lot of children. But do you ever talk to them? Do you ever ask if they're happy? I think maybe you forgot how." He blinked, taken aback. "Who wrote this?" "I did," Lily whispered. "I wanted you to hear it out loud. Sometimes grown-ups forget how words sound when they come from the heart." Alexander stared at her, at the tiny IV line in her arm, at the quiet bravery in her eyes, and for the first time in years, something shifted inside him. He didn't know why, but that one letter suddenly felt heavier than any business deal he had ever made. That night, the city glittered outside. Alexander Grant's penthouse, 1,000 lights dancing, across the skyline of Manhattan. But he didn't see any of it. The letter lay on his desk, slightly crumpled, as if it refused to be ignored. He poured himself a glass of scotch, but the burn of the alcohol didn't quiet his mind. Every word from that shaky handwriting echoed in his head. "Do you ever talk to them? Do you ever ask if they're happy?" He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had built an empire from nothing, hundreds of employees, dozens of companies under his name, and more money than he could ever spend. But when was the last time he had actually listened to someone, really listened? He remembered the little girl's face. Lily. Her voice had been so gentle, yet her words had struck him harder than any corporate rival ever had. For the first time in years, he had no clever response, no excuse. The next morning, his assistant found him already in the office, something that hadn't happened in years. He was reading through the hospital's donation records. "Sir, you asked for these files?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "And find me the contact information for Dr. Alvarez, the head of the pediatric ward." By noon, he was back at the hospital. The nurse at the reception looked surprised. "Mr. Grant? You're back?" "Yes," he replied simply. "Where's Lily Carter's room?" Her face softened. "She's not in her room today. She was moved to intensive care this morning." His chest tightened. "Intensive care? She wanted me to give you this if you came." The nurse handed him another small piece of paper. He unfolded it. Inside, in the same uneven handwriting, it said, "Don't forget my drawing. I'll show it to you when I get better." Alexander stood there, frozen. The noise of the hospital faded into silence around him. That little girl and that tiny voice had somehow pierced through the fortress he'd built around his heart. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, as if it were something priceless. For the first time in a very long while, Alexander Grant didn't know what to do next, only that he had to go back. The next day, Alexander stood outside the intensive care unit, staring through the glass window at the small figure lying in the bed. Lily looked even smaller now, her face pale, her body surrounded by tubes and blinking monitors. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the suffocating quiet. He felt out of place there, A man in a $5,000 suit among exhausted parents and crying children, yet something in him refused to leave. A nurse approached and handed him a folded piece of paper. "She drew this for you earlier," the nurse said softly. "She told me you'd come back." Alexander unfolded the paper. It was a simple drawing made with crayons. A little girl stood beside a tall man in a dark suit. Between them, a bright yellow sun smiled over a small house and a tree. Above, in uneven letters, were written the words, "Now you're not alone anymore." For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. Why would she draw this for me?" he asked, his voice cracking. Dr. Alvarez, the pediatric specialist, stood nearby and answered quietly, "Lily says she likes to draw families for people who don't seem to have one." Alexander looked at him sharply. "She said that?" "Yes, she said you looked lonely." The words hit him harder than he expected. Lonely? He, Alexander Grant, one of the most powerful men in New York. He wanted to laugh it off, but instead his throat tightened. He sat beside Lily's bed, unsure what to say. Her eyes fluttered open slightly. "You came back," she whispered. "I did," he said gently. "You promised to show me your drawing, remember?" A small smile touched her lips. "You like it?" "I love it," he replied, his voice breaking. "You made me look happy." She nodded slowly. "That's because you are. You just forgot." A nurse adjusted her IV, and Lily drifted back to sleep. Alexander stayed seated, staring at the crayon colors that now meant more to him than any $1 million contract. He didn't know it yet, but that drawing, that innocent picture of sunlight and connection, would soon change the entire direction of his life. Days passed, and Alexander found himself returning to the hospital every evening after work. The staff stopped questioning it. Even the security guards began greeting him with quiet smiles. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't rushing anywhere. He wasn't checking stock prices or reviewing quarterly reports. He was sitting beside an 8-year-old girl who somehow made the world feel real again. Every night, Lily would ask him to read to her. Fairy tales mostly, stories of knights and miracles and happy endings. She liked the ones where the hero didn't win by fighting but by being kind. "You like those ones best," Alexander said one night, closing the book. "Why?" She shrugged, her voice soft. "Because kindness is harder than being brave. Grown-ups forget that." He stared at her, the truth of it cutting deep. No board meeting, no business deal had ever taught him that kind of wisdom. On the 5th night, as snow fell outside the window, Lily looked weaker. Her hands trembled when she reached for his. "Mr. Grant," she whispered, "can I ask you something?" "Anything." "If I don't wake up tomorrow, will you promise me something?" His heart stopped for a moment. "Lily, don't say that." "You're going to—" She shook her head faintly. "Please, promise." He swallowed hard. "I promise." "What is it?" She smiled, just barely. "Do you remember my drawing? The little house and the tree?" "Of course. I want you to build it. For other kids, a place where they can feel happy, like they belong. Can you do that?" Tears welled in his eyes, something he hadn't felt in decades. "Yes," he whispered. "I'll build it. I swear." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Then I'm not scared anymore." Outside, the snowflakes danced in the glow of the streetlights, covering the city in quiet white. For the first time, Alexander didn't see them as cold. They looked like tiny pieces of hope falling from the sky. That night he stayed until morning, watching her sleep. When the first light of dawn touched the window, he knew he'd keep his promise, no matter what it cost. The call came early the next morning. Alexander was sitting at his desk. Halfway through typing an email he suddenly couldn't remember the purpose of, when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen, St. Mary's Hospital, froze him in place. "Mr. Grant?" It was the nurse's voice, quiet and trembling. "I'm so sorry. Lily passed away just before sunrise." For a moment he couldn't breathe. The world around him seemed to tilt. The city sounds outside muffled. His office suddenly too large, too empty. The nurse continued softly, "She left something for you." He drove to the hospital in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he arrived, the nurse met him in the hallway, holding a small sealed envelope, the same pink paper Lily used for her letters. Her eyes glistened as she handed it to him. She said you'd understand what it means. He walked to the small chapel at the end of the corridor and sat down alone in one of the pews. The letter trembled in his hands as he unfolded it. The handwriting was wobbly but full of heart. Dear Mr. Grant, thank you for coming back. I know you're busy, but you stayed. That means you have a good heart. I'm going to live in the sky now with my dad, but you have to finish my picture. Build the house, plant the tree, and make sure the kids have someone to hold their hand. Don't forget the sunshine. It's for you, too. A single tear hit the paper, smudging the last word. Love. Alexander sat there for a long time, unable to move. He wasn't thinking about the company, the meetings, or the money. Just a little girl with crayons and hope, who somehow saw the part of him he'd buried long ago. When he finally stood, something inside him had changed. He tucked the letter into his breast pocket, close to his heart, and whispered, I won't forget, Lily, I promise. Outside, the morning sun was breaking through the gray clouds over Manhattan, bathing the skyline in gold. For the first time in years, Alexander felt it, not as light but as warmth. A year later, the city skyline glimmered under the spring sun. But far from the noise and rush of Manhattan, something new stood quietly on a green hill in upstate New York, a bright, white building surrounded by laughter. It was called Lily's Place. The sign at the entrance was simple, carved into wood by hand. Children ran through the yard, chasing bubbles, painting murals on the walls, and planting flowers. There were no corporate logos, no speeches, no photographers, just warmth, joy, and life. Alexander Grant stood near the edge of the playground, dressed not in a suit but in a plain sweater and jeans. He watched as volunteers helped kids paint a giant sun on the fence. The same smiling sun that Lily had drawn in her picture. Dr. Alvarez approached him quietly. She'd be proud, he said. Alexander smiled faintly, his eyes soft. No, he replied. She'd probably tell me to add more colors. They both laughed. At the center of the courtyard stood a tall oak tree, its leaves shimmering in the light. Beneath it was a small bronze plaque that read, For Lily Carter, the little girl who reminded us that kindness builds the strongest homes. Every child who came to Lily's Place had their own story. Some were sick, some abandoned, some just needed somewhere to belong, and each of them found warmth here. Alexander made sure of that. Sometimes he'd sit under the oak tree with a book of fairy tales, the same ones. Lily loved and read aloud to whoever would listen. The children would gather around him, giggling, asking questions, interrupting every few lines. He didn't mind. One afternoon, a little girl tugged at his sleeve and handed him a crayon drawing, a tall man and a child under a tree. It's you, she said proudly. And her. Alexander's throat tightened. He smiled, taking the picture gently. That's perfect, he whispered. As the sun began to set, he looked up at the glowing sky, gold and pink, soft and peaceful. For the first time in his life, Alexander Grant didn't feel powerful or rich. He felt whole. Because somewhere above, he knew Lily was smiling, and the house beneath the tree was finally complete.